Okay? Every slave and free man. We don't think of slavery. But what God calls slavery still exists. Chad has slavery. Mauritania has slavery. Sudan has slavery. Niger has slavery. Each one of them, it's rich Muslims with poor blacks who are their slaves. Literal slavery. But then you have other kinds of slavery in the world, like when Saudi sheiks go to India and they buy little girls for $200 from their family and call it an employment contract. It's slavery. But there's another kind of slavery. It is called APR. God did not allow usury because he knew it would lead to slavery. God did not allow for the permanent expropriation of property from families as delineated by Joshua. In the year of Jubilee, it had to be restored. God would not allow these things for his people. In the millennium, we will not have these things. Okay? But you bring about slavery by economic means, as it happened in the book of Amos. They may not call it slavery, but the fact is somebody else owns your land if you have a mortgage. The fact is you're working for somebody else if you are paying a high APR. If you are trying to balance your future on credit, you're working for somebody else. There is a credit balloon globally. We're talking now of trillions and trillions of dollars. Now, much of this is private debt. A fair amount is corporate debt, and a huge amount is government debt. But where does governments get the money to service the interest on their debt? From their people. Now, we don't think of it in the Western world yet. You remember Ceausescu in Romania? You had to have 5 children because he needed this much of a workforce to increase GNP to pay his debt. He lived salubriously. The people were virtual slaves, kept in line by the Securitata. It was slavery. The Iron Curtain was slavery. This becomes global. Now, how did this kind of slavery come about? It came about through people talking about social enterprises. It came about through people talking about Marxist principles. What is the first principle of Marxism? Man is God. The proletariat should control the economy. The proletariat should control the government. Wonderful principles, but what you wind up with is something worse than capitalism. What they wound up with was a party elite who enslaved the people. As far as the Soviets were concerned, those people were simply their serfs, their slaves. To the point where Ceausescu would basically breed human beings. He would literally breed them for an economic motive. We have to understand what the Bible means by slavery. Yes, literal slavery exists in the Islamic world, and with the growth of Islam, it's increasing. Why did slavery end in Britain and America? Wesley, Wilberforce, Shaftesbury, because of the gospel. You take the gospel away, you're going to have slavery again. Already in London, they had housemaids from the Philippines working for Saudi Arabian executives and diplomats. These women were being beaten, starved, flogged. What? You forgot to dust the bookshelf? and they would just beat them. These women's visas to live in Britain were dependent upon their employer. Sorry, you can go back to the rubbish heaps of Manila, or you can stay here and do what we do. Money talks. Money talks. This goes on in America. Islam is a slave religion. You are allowing in a religion that breeds slavery. Islam is only one aspect. If you look at the debt explosion, if you look at third world debt, the IMF has to put conditions on third world countries. The World Bank must put conditions on third world countries to service the interest on their existing debt. Otherwise, you'd have a banking crisis in Europe, America, and Japan. If these countries all defaulted at the same time, you'd have a crisis here. They would drag the developed world down with them. So they've redefined insolvency. They've redefined bankruptcy as not simply a default on principle. Now the World Bank and the IMF has had to redefine insolvency as inability to service the interest on the principal. In other words, it's not your inability to pay back the loan, it's your inability to pay the interest on the loan. Hence, you have a third world where people have slave conditions. You can't raise wages. You must work for this because we have to make these commitments to the IMF to keep ourselves solvent. Well, they want third world debt relief. And Africa. Africa has received nearly $1 trillion in international aid since the 1960s, more than any other continent. The fact that most of it was misappropriated, misallocated, and stolen is not the issue to them. Give us more. Now, anybody who's been to Africa understands it's futile to give debt relief to Africa because they'll just go back and get right back in the same mess unless you get rid of these despotic governments like Mugabe and the ANC in South Africa. You're throwing good money after bad. The only way to help Africans is for Christians to help the people directly, but to try to help these governments, it doesn't work. You're throwing good money after bad. So now you got a situation. They are enslaving their people to meet the conditions of the IMF and World Bank. If they don't, we have a banking crisis in the developed world, and you'll see what they did. What did Barclays do when it began getting in trouble with third world debt? Laying people off. Sorry, you used to wait in line 10 minutes for Barclays Bank. Now you wait in line 20 minutes. We have to lay off tellers. They increased their service charges for their own customers in England or anywhere else. They tried to get it from us, you understand? This creates an issue that is going to bring about something the book of Revelation calls slavery. Third world debt is a humongous issue. And as far as debt relief, forget it. You'll be throwing good money after bad because of these despotic governments. They will just steal it and mismanage it. Just take a look. Singapore, Malaysia, they became independent the same time as Ghana. Yet in Asia, you have economic growth. In Africa, major areas of Latin America, the Caribbean, you don't. What's the problem here? What's the problem? Well, the problem is, obviously, it's sin, it's corruption, it's false religion, idolatry. These things make problems. The closer a Muslim nation is to Mecca, the more injustice it's going to have. It's amazing. Even countries with a lot of oil and low populations, like Kuwait, you get two classes of people. You'd think with such a low population and all that money, there would be less poverty. Saudi Arabia, they don't like to talk about it, but all that money is in the hands of the House of Saud. There's poverty. You go away from Mecca towards Malaysia, What do you see? The further away they are from Mecca, the more affluence among the Muslims. Chinese business community makes Malaysia a prosperous country. False religion brings poverty. Now the money preachers have corrupted this for their own purpose. But in the last days, in the book of Revelation, this whole thing that is already coming to a climax now, the issue of third world debt, the issue of first world debt, the issue of personal debt. It not only comes to a climax, it explodes, where you basically have an institutionalized practice of de facto slavery. It doesn't matter what they call it. People would say, Ceausescu didn't have slaves. God says, yes, he did. What's the difference? Talk to people who went to Romania and saw those orphanages after Ceausescu fell. There's no other word for it. It was slavery. There was no other word. What did Stalin do to the Ukrainians? There's no other word for it. It was slavery. Slavery. Slavery is going to come back big time. And I don't just mean to the third world. You're going to see an institutionalized slavery. All they'll do is call it something else. They'll call it something else. But it will still be based on things like race. It will still be based on things like class. Don't think when the book of Revelation talks about things like slavery, people will see that and say, well, this proves it couldn't be for modern times or have a future meaning. There's no slavery anymore. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they are talking about. There is slavery. Most people are not economically independent. A free man is that. If somebody has more debt than they have assets, they're already becoming enslaved. So this issue explodes. The kings of the earth, the great men and commanders, the rich and strong, and every slave and free man. Somebody's socioeconomic status, the nation of their citizenship, their position will no longer matter. Being an oligarch, being a baron, being a tycoon, being a senior executive, being a key professional, or being somebody who works in a petrol station, or being a slave in Mauritania. It doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter. You can't take it with you unless you give it to Jesus when you're alive.